you don't feel committed to raise your hand just because I'm asking. So, open source initiative was founded back in 1998 by a few folks you might recognize either through their names or pictures. Probably the most known is Eric Raymond on the left there. And the OSI really started as a response to the free software and the misperceptions around free as in freedom versus free beer. Too many folks were thinking, well, free software, that just means it's free in terms of I don't have to pay for it. And so the one, they were looking for a more marketable name, something that conveyed the message of shareable and open to be exposed to the community and participate. And there's the Free Software Foundation, which manages a lot of the free software that's out there that has a slightly different license. We'll get into licensing. But the group's been around, like I said, since 1998, and it was really formed to raise awareness and promote the idea of whatever you call it, the idea of shared development, transparency, free distribution of the work in order to create better software. The idea that the open source development methodology actually enables higher quality software at a faster development rate. So it's been an education and advocacy group for a while. And again, as I was saying, its sort of mission here is as a nonprofit with a global perspective. It's recognized as the organization that authenticates and certifies open source licenses. So there's the open source definition, which is a set of criteria that all licenses that are submitted to the OSI are run against, and if the OSI believes that the license upholds the attributes and conforms to the definition, then it's released as an open source license. So those are things like the Apache license, the MIT license, the BSD license. We also recognize the GPL, the GNU licenses, and again, it's not that those can't be applied to open source, but the Free Software Foundation has a stricter definition and sets of criteria for its licensing. By all means, if you have any questions or comments as we go, I'm happy to, if you want to throw something at me because you don't agree with what I'm saying, that's fine too. So if you just type in open source nowadays into Google or whatever you happen to like, there's tons of stuff. There's everything from software, there's open hardware here, little icons. It's become quite broader than just the original vision of the development methodology and the licensing scheme. Bart Simpson up there somehow is doing something with open source. So, open source software projects, a group called Black Duck did a survey. There's a market research group, sector research, and they're estimating that by 2014 there'll be 2 million open source projects out there. And that the open source projects are doubling every 14 months. And what that means is that the code contribution, the number of people who are participating in open source, so I've got a project and there's 100 of us, well, in 14 months there'll be 200 of us, and there'll be, instead of 100,000 lines, there'll be 200,000 lines. And instead of 100 projects, there'll be 200 projects. So we're seeing a tremendous amount of growth in the use of open source development methodologies and licensing associated with software. Another stat that people always used to talk about when open source was combined to the data centers and the back-end operations of an organization, they used to talk about Linux and Apache distributions. Well, I think it's actually interesting now to look at sort of more front-end end-user applications. And you can look there at the second bullet point that three popular WordPress, Drupal, and Joomla, three popular CMSs or blog tools in WordPress's case. The growth in the conferences, which indicates how many more folks like you have discovered open source, and not just from a development standpoint, but from an end-user standpoint. You're using Drupal because, for whatever reason, you might not be contributing code to the Drupal project or code to the WordPress project, but you are using the tool. And the folks that you're working with aren't developers and programmers and administrators of the application, but the designers and their content managers and their folks that normally aren't seen as part of the open source crowd because they're not coders. And then finally, you always got to have a Gartner quote in there to make it legitimate for the CIO crowd. And it shows that the heavy adoption of open source within industry. So this is sort of the developers, users, and organizations. We also have the methodology, or the ideology and the method. So I did a search of open source asterisk in Wikipedia. And these are just some of the more interesting responses that I found. So there's open source beer, open source cola, open source warfare. That sounds scary. So there's all sorts of open source, fill in whatever you think, which I think is a testament to the recognition that it's not a licensing issue only, it's also a development methodology. The idea around creating community for collaboration and co-creation, and that there's other artifacts that can be generated from that. So taking this idea that it's not just a licensing area for licensing software, but it's also a development methodology and, in fact, a cultural ideology around co-creation and sharing. What's the role, what is open source? So there's the typical Apache, Drupal, Linux, WordPress, LibreOffice, Ubuntu, those 2 million projects that I had up there. There's also the idea of the licensing, which I talked about. Copyleft versus permissive licensing. So the idea here is I won't get into that, but that's a typical, are people familiar with the sort of debate around licensing, arguments around licensing? Are people familiar with open source licensing and free software? One guy's waving his hand very adamantly back there. He must be very intimately aware of that. So I'll get to that in a minute, but that's traditionally what the OSI has been focused on, supporting open source projects and helping to promote and raise adoption of open source licenses. But there's also the development methodology. So again, what are those characteristics that an organization that wants to work in open source, what are those characteristics that are most valuable to creating the project? How do you raise awareness around the project to foster participation? What's the governance model like to allow for ideas and a meritocracy or a duocracy or whatever it might be that allows for the emergence of new features and functionality? What is it beyond just the development core group that's required for a project to be successful? Marketing folks, business analysts, all those folks, the developers who started this rogue project don't usually like to hang out with, legal folks, and all those types of folks that normally I spend all my time developing. I don't want to have to deal with business. I don't want to sell out. I don't want to, but as your project becomes more popular and more useful, you'll realize that you slowly are running out of internal resources, or you might not have the actual skill set or anyone in your community to make that next jump. At some point, your development methodology isn't enough. You actually have to have a community development methodology, not just a software development methodology. And I just want to, so there's the cultural aspect. Open source obviously started in started in 1998, but before that, there's the Free Software Foundation. Even before that, there's the activities around Unix. And if you're old enough, like I am, there's the old shareware and the freeware sort of movements before that. But that whole idea of the commons has bled into, again, tying into the open source everything. The Creative Commons, the Pirate Party, which is a political organization, crowdfunding, crowdsourcing like Kickstarter, education like MOOCs and Khan Academy, where you have, again, all the content is going to be available, all the intellectual property, things that are normally restricted and not allowed to share. Because it has some value because I own it and therefore I can charge you for it. All of that's taken back or put to the side now with this new sort of cultural ideology, which raises some sort of interesting situations. And I just want folks familiar with the recent Facebook purchase of Oculus. People know Leslie, you must be a lawyer or somebody. Anyone familiar with Oculus, the 3D visor thing that's supposed to be unbelievably, you have one with you? You're familiar with this, right? And Facebook just recently purchased it for $2 billion last week, right? So that's an interesting sort of problem, or maybe not a problem, but a situation to find yourself in if you're Oculus. If you went out to the Kickstarter community and you asked for some money, and people donated thinking, hey, that's a cool idea, and you're a cool person, and we think that'll be really great if this was available, so here's some money for you to develop this. And in fact, one of the big contributors was the founder of Mojang, the Minecraft folks who make Minecraft. So I think he gave like $100,000. So I choose to participate in what I think is going to be this great community. We're all going to give something, and I'm not going to maybe be developing the hardware, but I think you're doing a good job, so here's some money. And the same thing can be true for an open source project. I'm not going to contribute code, but here's some money, or here's some marketing expertise, or here's some promotional expertise, or whatever it might be. So we're creating community around this, and we want you to develop something. Well, then all of a sudden, we've got Facebook comes in and buys it. Well, I just gave you $100,000, and now what do I have? Right? So we've got this culture of open, and this idea of openness, and this ideology of shared and collaborative development for co-creation, peer development. But there's really a need to understand what are the boundaries of these communities. So when you're engaging with an open source project, you understand the licensing and the governance so that your contributions, whatever reciprocal engagement you're expecting, fine, take it, I'm done with it, I don't care, or I expect people to contribute back the same way, is that understood? And what we want to do is, what the OSI is interested in, is making sure that those relationships are clearly understood. We don't want anyone to join a project, whatever the project might be, with an expectation that they're going to receive back or be able to contribute in some way, take on a role within the organization that perhaps isn't actually available to them, or their participation isn't going to be accepted or appreciated. We were working, before I joined the OSI, I was working in higher education, and I was working with an open source project. And I was working at a very small school that didn't have a lot of money compared to large institutions with big grants or private institutions, and I wanted to participate. We had developed a identity management integration for Don't Laugh, Lotus Notes, and it was a way to integrate that with this, I won't name the project, but with this project. And they didn't want they didn't want my contribution. And I said, well, why not? I realize there's not a lot of Lotus Notes shops in the world anymore, but for those that are still around, maybe they want this. And the person told me, those who bring the gold make the rules. And the idea was that, well, this open source project was going to be driven by those people who contributed the most dollars. So they're going to be able to define that. So at that point I realized, well, is that really open? And maybe that's fine if you tell me that ahead of time, but what I have adopted is, if I'd known your governance policy, if I would have understood the licensing associated with it, if I would have understood the roles available for everyone. So yes, we want to definitely certify licenses. We think that's important for the open source initiative. We want to advocate for the use of open source development, because we do believe that open source development methodologies yield better software, higher, more secure software, reduce development times, see greater introduction of new features and tools, all the benefits of open source in terms of development, but it also is beneficial for the community. Transparency in the community and around decision making, best practices for gathering requirements and for testing. All those sorts of things are made available or made possible through open source development methodologies. Education on how to run and foster open source projects. So let's say you've got this great little kernel of a project that you want to start, but you don't have a group of people around you yet that are interested, or you don't have the resources to post it or to share information. You need a wiki or whatever it might be. So what are the best practices? What are the technologies available to help you promote your project? And also even more mature projects. We work with the Apache Foundation, Linux Foundation, Eclipse Foundation, Mozilla. Those organizations might need help or be able to offer services to other emerging open source projects or cross-pollinate between the larger projects themselves. Working with industry, private sector, public sector, government, education to introduce open source adoptions. One of the big problems since we're at a higher ed institution here, with the adoption of open source within higher education is that as a public institution, you're often required to undertake specific procurement procedures. So the state or whatever agency that higher ed or the institution might be under requires them to put together and undertake specific activities. So we have to do an RFP, request for proposals. And that request for proposals goes out to companies, and the companies respond with their solutions for the software. Well, obviously, open source projects aren't going to have a marketing and a group perhaps to come back and say, oh, you should use this Moodle learning management system or the beadwork calendar, which is a fantastic project, by the way. So, can we work with the public sector to change procurement processes to be more inclusive and not have a bias against open source software and projects? And then finally, to authenticate, I don't know if that's a good word, but to help organizations work as good citizens within the open source community. So this is the mandate. Remember, again, I had that a couple slides ago, but I put here, maybe this was just coincidental or fortuitous that when the mission was originally written, it wasn't specific to software. It just says open source. And considering the use of open source beyond software and open source hardware and open data and open access, it's interesting to ask whether or not any of the activities that we're currently doing are also applicable outside the software and perhaps in technology. That might be obvious, but maybe even beyond that. So the OSI, for a long time, had been a centralized organization that, like I said, was founded by a few leaders in software development who were challenging sort of the status quo. And that group started, and that was the board, and they were a self-appointed board. They basically found other people that were doing interesting things. They pulled them in to help with projects. They began to reach out to successful projects and ask them to participate. And they are also a working board. That is, there's 11 members of the board, and they all took on assignments both for the operations, day-to-day sort of things, and also perhaps larger strategic activities. And they really took on the idea of quiet persuasion rather than public advocacy. Because what they wanted to do was create an actual value proposition that they could put in front of organizations and make an argument not based on this is the right thing to do, and which it is, but say this is a better return on investment. This yields a lower total cost of ownership. This provides better functionality and development. To really be able to make arguments that the individual decision makers within the organizations could understand that really hit home for them. So that was sort of how it was. And then about 2 years ago, the board sort of reorganized itself. And it wanted to move to a member-driven organization. So in June of 2012, they opened up the membership campaign where individuals, all of us, and I'm sure we're all members, right? We're all members of the OSI, could basically sign up. And from that, there's individual memberships and there's also affiliate memberships. And the affiliates are represented non-profit, not-for-profit organizations. So there's a variety here. Some of them you'll recognize on the right here, this group. And these are all folks who are supporting the OSI's mission. And what we like to do is create an ecosystem where these groups can work together and find projects that they might be interested in working in, or activities that they might be interested in working on that promote open source in general. We're actually having our elections right now, and we've switched the board to be elected from the individual and the affiliate memberships. So there's 5 seats on the board that are elected by the individual membership, and there's 5 seats on the board that are elected out of the affiliates. So now the board will be representational of the community itself, and that's where we get the membership led and driven. So that we'll be able to, the membership and the representatives will be able to pick the directions and activities. We've also started a working group project where these affiliates or members of the community can approach us to get sponsorship for working groups. So we've got folks that come to us, and one group came out of Ericsson and also from the University of Toronto, and they want to help project managers understand open source, because often a project manager at a large company is used to working with a contractor, and they've been trained in the classic project management methodology, PMI or something like that, and there's not really an understanding of how open source communities work. What do you mean there's no development timeline? What do you mean there's no, they might not fit into what they're expecting? So that's an example of one of the working groups that's come forward, and the goal is to create training material for project managers to be able to engage with open source communities in order to better implement those technologies within their own organizations. Project support, so if your project is starting out and you need some help, we might direct you to Outer Curve is a great example. They serve as almost an incubator, I guess that's a fair word, where if you need support and you need guidance and you're looking for a model, someone who's successfully run a project, they have mentors to help you do that. The Aperio Foundation does the same thing in higher ed. Where if you're starting a project within higher ed and you want some help, you can look to one of their mentors and they'll provide you support services. We also do that, so if you need a platform, a wiki, and a desktop collaboration tool, you can approach us about project support. Local chapters, we're starting up the idea of having, in order to have a truly distributed environment, setting up local chapters of OSI members that might want to work on projects or might want support to introduce open source within their own communities. And finally, we have sponsorships. We work with the corporate sector for actually, because we need money to run the organization. So those are some of our corporate sponsors there as well. So the last thing I'll end here, and I didn't see the 5-minute go up. Oh, there it is, 5 minutes. So perfect timing. Is I think there's a real opportunity to participate in the OSI if you're interested. So you could, as an example, the Open Source Festival could become an affiliate. There's no cost to becoming an affiliate. The Linux Fest Northwest, which is a huge Linux conference in Seattle, is an affiliate. And so the idea is we help promote the activities, we can help bring sponsorship, introduce sponsorship potential, and so on to help the organization or the affiliate. And then we hope as you mature, you also will help other people, because this is the open source shared model we want to facilitate. We can have a local chapter, OSI at UAlbany, OSI at Albany, Capital District, New York, however big that the organization might want to be. Individual memberships. If you really do believe in open source, then this is your opportunity to not only be a member and introduce your ideas, but you can run for the board, you can take on other leadership roles, you can form a working group for a particular project that you're interested in to help open source. We'll support you, we'll give you, we have a student that emailed me from India who wants to introduce open source to their campus. We put them in touch with Open Hatch, which is a great project that brings open source to campuses and introduces it to students and creates curriculum with faculty and so on. It's a great program. So if you wanted to do that, we could help you there. And then finally, as the first employee who just happens to live in Albany, I'm using my experience here as a test implementation for a chapter. Real quickly, Skodak Central School District has a building that they've moved the students out of. And they're giving office space, including power and heating and wireless and conference rooms and so on to any startup. So I found out about this and I said, well, this would be a great place for the OSI to have a regional office, and we could get interns or volunteers, and we could introduce these startups to open source software as a way to reduce their startup costs. They could run, Linux desktop and LibreOffice or OpenOffice instead of Microsoft Office. We could help them with servers, OpenStack or something. I'm sure that they might want to host their environment on or whatever. And so I'm very interested in creating a test model here for the OSI. If you're interested in participating, and even if you're not a developer, if you're interested in program management or marketing or communications or operations, event planning, or working with other startups or entrepreneurial activities, let me know. And we've set up an office there, and we'll supply you with everything you need. And that's a way for you to get involved directly in the open source movement and start contributing. So that's it. Any questions? If I have time.
We do have time for questions. Anyone?
Well, thanks very much.